Hey my friends, how are y'all today? My name is Misty Sims, and if you found me, you found my little corner of the internet that I like to call Beyond Reasonable Doubt, where we talk all things true crime, culty, and a little creepy. If you're new here, thank you so much for clicking on that video link, and if all that I've said so far sounds like your jam, go ahead and smash that subscribe button and notification bell so that you can hang out with me every week. And if you're a returning subscriber, y'all already know I love you more than cupcakes and sprinkles. And I hope everybody had a fantastic end of 2024, and 2023, we're not done with 24, but we're here to kick off 24 with a wild story for this channel today. Now, it is no secret that the poor and orphans have not always exactly been treated kindly in the past. Authors like Dickens and Jack London have written about the awful abuses going on back in the early 1800s in England with things like workhouses and such, bad conditions. But we forget that it was prominent to take advantage of the less unfortunate, even in areas in big cities in the U.S., that we don't think of things like that going on today. In America, the Civil War, World War I, and the flu pandemic of the early 1900s left many orphans and vulnerable people who couldn't take care of their children, outside of sending them into lives of indentured servitude. Well, in the 1920s, a woman called Georgia Tann was going to come onto the scene and change that by making adoption a household word here in the United States. Adoption would become normalized for the first time. And she carried a very reputable name for herself in her organization, which was called the Tennessee Children's Home Society, located in Memphis. She operated for over 20 years and slowly became the topic of some rumors and rumblings, but she wouldn't be investigated while she was alive and operational. And little did everyone know that she was committing crimes they couldn't dream of by stealing babies, manipulating and coercing people in predominant positions to keep her little enterprise up and running. She had a complete black market operation for stolen children to be adopted out to rich out-of-state families, and enough coercion for people to turn and look the other way. She was literally selling babies, and with the corruption and the cover-ups, birth parents had no way of finding their children in the future. Children who weren't adopted were subject to severe abuse and awful conditions, and sometimes even death. And the sad thing being that adoption is such an amazing gift, but it had terrifying behind-the-scenes repercussions. So today, my friends, we're going to peel back the curtain and learn of the terror known as Georgia Tann. So let's dive right on in. So to give you a little background on Memphis, Memphis, Tennessee was founded in 1819 by John Overton, Andrew Jackson, and James Winchester after the Treaty of Tuscaloosa ceded the territory from the Chickasaw to the U.S. Its name stemmed from its position on the river, much like the capital of ancient Egypt that sat on the Nile. In the late 1800s saw Memphis turn just pretty filthy. It had poor sanitation. People were emptying receptacles like outhouses just straight into the river. So when the river would flood or overflow, like all this yuck, it's going to be on the ground and pooling in water. And you know how like water will stand in puddles. Well, then of course you've got mosquitoes who are going to hop from puddle to puddle, and then they're going to bite people. And this began the spread of yellow fever in the city, and it just crushed the booming area. People got scared, as we've seen in other pandemics and epidemics, and they fled the city. By the late 1878, the city population had dwindled down to 19,000, and 17,000 of those had the yellow fever. It was an absolutely terrifying time and left the city in disarray. Most folks who were left were poverty-stricken. They were working class or African American. There were a few churches and brave doctors that tried to stay behind and take care of the sick, but the city was just shook. And it ended up becoming bankrupt. And the upper and middle class, they had flown the coop. So the city was going to struggle for years to get back on its feet. And the population would remain extremely vulnerable for several years, which made way for greedy business owners to just move in and take advantage of folks. And then a lot of corrupt politicians to take office. It would see dark times of a lot of abuse and slaying of African Americans. And it was just a terrifying time to be living in Memphis. And as Memphis is seeing some of these darkest and roughest times, that we don't think about that today, right? Like when we think of Memphis, you think of things like the Blues, Elvis, Graceland, Memphis barbecue, the Memphis wrestling territory, river-based industry. None of this was there at that time. It was not budding and blooming. It was crumbling. Well, this is when E.H. or Boss Crump came into power as mayor of the city. He used a lot of manipulation and corruption to stay in that power. And that brought in more gang violence, that brought in more homicides. And people just sort of looked the other way. They were all in his pocket. And he was in power for over 50 years. And while he did some good things, he modernized like sewer systems and such, he was going to make some pretty unsavory friends along the way and let them do some pretty unsavory things. And one of those friends was Georgia Tann. And she would bring shame to him and the city. So who is Georgia Tann? Born in Philadelphia, Mississippi on July 18, 1891 to parents Beulah and George Tann. Beulah George Tann, who goes by Georgia, was actually the oldest of their two children, but she was their only biological child. Her brother Roy was adopted into the family, and it's speculated that he was actually 3 years younger than Georgia, but they always oddly portrayed him as the oldest son. Now, Georgia's mother, Beulah, was a little bit of a trailblazer. She worked outside the home as a school teacher, and that was actually frowned upon during these times, but she did it anyway, so kudos to Beulah. George was a lawyer and judge of the 2nd District of Mississippi, and George was never described nicely. He was always said to be cold, unaffectionate, domineering, arrogant, and these are all traits that go on to be used to describe Georgia. But George also had a large interest in the well-being of orphans, and he was even known to bring orphaned and neglected children into their home and try to figure out what to do with them long term. So while he had high hopes that Georgia was going to go on to be this concert pianist, and he had her in piano lessons since she was like age 5, possibly after seeing his interest in these forgotten children, she became interested in social work herself. She went on to graduate college with a degree in music, but she had on the side been taking several courses in social work at Columbia University over a couple of summers. And she would go on to become a teacher, teaching music at Hickory High School, but she just ultimately decided she hated music. She wanted to be a lawyer like her dad. So he helped her and tutored her and mentored her, and she actually was successfully able to pass the bar in Mississippi. But her dad didn't want her to practice law because apparently it was unusual for women to have that type of career back in the day. So she fell into a career that was quote unquote okay for an unmarried woman to have, and that did kind of interest her, and that was social work. Now, Georgia, she never expressed an interest in marriage, but she did in June of 1918 pay her parents a visit, and she brought home a friend of hers and a woman named Anne Atwood. Now, back then, any type of non-conventional relationship or homosexuality wasn't even discussed in the South, right? You didn't talk about it. And even though she was a little non-conforming with her dress code, because she wore what they would consider back then more like manly attire, flannel shirts and pants as opposed to dresses and skirts, she didn't introduce this lady as her partner, probably out of fear of acceptance. But I would assume that might be also why she didn't express interest in marriage, since she wasn't able to openly formalize her partnership with Anne. But they would go out in public together. They would refer to each other as sisters, and they were cohabitating until the day she died. Now, outside of their relationship, Anne did become pregnant in 1924. And she would go on to adopt the last name Hollingsworth, seemingly to make it seem like she had been married before. And that was rumored to be the last name of the man who fathered her son. So, maybe just to kind of save a little face, being unmarried and pregnant. And Georgia also adopted a daughter named June in 1922. So they had this little family of sorts, and then they did decide to relocate over to Memphis in 1924. Georgia had some experience in social work where she'd worked in a home society in Meridian and Mississippi and Texas. So she kind of went right into the Memphis, Tennessee Children's Home Society. Although make it a mental note that she was asked to leave that Meridian location due to questionable placement methods. And we're for sure about to see what that means. So what's the Tennessee Children's Home Society? Well, it was started in 1897. And its home base was in Nashville up until 1913, but then it was granted charters for locations in Chattanooga, Jackson, and Memphis. The Memphis location was seated in a mansion at 1556 Poplar Street, and by 1926, Georgia would be supervising the entire operation at the Memphis home. Her partner Anne didn't officially work for her there, but it's believed that she authored a lot of her correspondence going in and out. And it's thought that Georgia saw how much money could be made by selling the kids in this orphanage to the affluent families. And at this time, this wasn't completely illegal, even if it was immoral. So Georgia was about to launch herself a full-fledged business. Now, adoptions hadn't been seen at this time as desirable. And even though she was building a black market business on the back end, she did reshape the way people looked at adoption, which we do thank her for doing because it should have never been looked upon poorly. But her methods, they leave us something that just doesn't leave a desirable taste in our mouth. Georgia would sell these kids to these families by saying that they were quote unquote blank slates. And what that meant was they won't remember their birth family and they could just smoothly integrate into their adopted family. Now remember, some of these kids are old enough to remember being adopted. So it doesn't really hold water. But nonetheless, people bought into it. And then she was also able to sell them on the idea that each child is precious. And so they deserve to be adopted regardless of their ethnicities or being born to unworthy parents. Now, this was a pretty big deal at the time because while true, a lot of people didn't want to adopt outside their bubbles, right? Unless they were adopting child slaves. So just remember the time that we're in. So she's trafficking these kids and selling what sounds like apple pie ideas and great things, but it's all based around the money. And she doesn't care a lick about these kids or the birth mothers. Most of these birth mothers were really young and poor and needy and very susceptible to manipulation based on their current life and financial situation. So she's preying on them and offering them medical care and things like this in exchange for their babies. I mean, she's a peach. She also wasn't looking into the adoptive parents' backgrounds whatsoever or the children's backgrounds. So who knows if these were good people taking these kids in or if the kid had a medical or hereditary condition that the parents needed to be aware of. She didn't care. She was just running them through a quick process, getting them finalized as quick as possible, and then pocketing that money. Investigators think, now that they've looked into it and back on it, that she was keeping about 90% of the adoption money. Because if you think about it, this was a state-funded orphanage, so the state is funneling money into her organization. So no one's really noticing that she's pocketing the money because the state funding is providing for the basic needs of the society home. So basically, state and tax money are keeping her lights on while she's pocketing as much as possible from these desperate families. I mean, like I said, a real Princess Peach here, right? She also did something that was really unheard of for the time, and she started posting ads in the press with photos of the orphans to gain exposure to potential adopted parents. And it's estimated that she ran over 400 of these classified type of ads, and her phone would blow up, especially around Christmas time, because she would target folks with the best pictures of these adorable kids and caption it with things like, "Ready for an early Christmas present?" And it's gross, right? But if you're wanting a family and adoption is how that plan is going to lay in for you, you don't want somebody playing with your emotions like this, right? You don't. And it feels like she's treating these human children like a new Stanley Cup or a PlayStation. And most of these kids were typically blonde hair, blue-eyed kids because she felt like they were the easiest to place. So she's gross and she's basically a Nazi. And nevertheless, it's working. Because if you want a family and you're struggling to become a parent, these photos are going to tug at you, especially at the holidays, right? And it would be impossible for them to not pull at your heartstrings. And she knew that. Georgia knew what she was doing. So she kept this up. She also started to spread the word around that adoption was very advantageous to taxpayers because it meant their tax dollars weren't going to pay orphanages or going to support unfit parents. She would brag about saving hundreds of thousands of dollars because she had placed over 2,000 children. I mean, she was confident. And then she started gaining national attention for her work. And she began giving speeches on child welfare and meeting, pretty high up people like Eleanor Roosevelt, President Truman. And she found herself labeled as the mother of modern adoption and became pretty highly respected in the community. And then she even gained world attention outside the U.S. because her waiting list for adoptive parents grew to residents in North and South America. But the problem with that is she started running out of kids. So what's a businesswoman to do? Well, if you answered C, start stealing babies, then you would be correct. She had people to start abducting these children. So she had a friendship with E.H. Crump, as we stated earlier, and his coercion of city employees and hospital workers worked to her advantage. And she started employing spotters to find pregnant women, children that they would see alone, or pick out less fortunate families as potential candidates to steal their children. And she even had a judge in her pocket with a welfare informant who would tell the judge of babies being born into poor families, and that judge would give an order that the babies had to be given to the state, and then of course he shotgunned them right into Georgia's care or her baby shop. Appeals would get filed, but they got immediately shut down because of all the blackmail going on and other methods that ultimately the stink-bait judge ended up being responsible for 1,000 babies being given to Georgia. Now, she would take babies from the hospital when they were only hours old, and doctors would tell her not to, but she'd do it anyway, and they wouldn't survive. Due to lack of medical care. And then she would even have doctors present these poor moms in labor with temporary custody papers saying it was so that babies could receive medical care, or even have them tell them that the baby was stillborn so that way she could take custody of it. Any tactic to get these babies that she so desperately wanted to be able to sell. And then for older children, they were just snatched off the side of the road, out of playgrounds. The kids would be told that their parents had died or that their parents gave them away because they couldn't take care of them. None of this true. And then she would change their birth certificates, dates, whatever she needed to do to make these children more desirable and to be adopted. And this also in turn made it pretty impossible for birth parents to ever find them because all their records were destroyed. She'd get rid of the actual paperwork and create new paperwork. Everything was a giant cover-up, right? Even though the doctors were in the pockets of the judge, they would still try to give her advice on what formula these babies that they were helping steal needed. So say that they needed a specific one for a condition. And she would ignore it. She wouldn't care. This would often lead to the infant not thriving and ultimately passing away. So sad. And in 1945, dysentery killed almost 50 babies in the home, all because she wouldn't separate the sick from the well. She had them packed in little sardines, 5 or 6 to a crib, because at the end of the day, it was just quantity to her. Quantity and money. Quantity and money. Some of the children who were a little older and able to recall their time at the home said that they suffered not only physical but also sexual abuse from Georgia and her employees. They recall being beaten, only given bread and water to eat for weeks at a time. There were 2 sisters who were abandoned by their mother and given to Georgia that said Georgia herself assaulted them. One was assaulted in a closet where orphans were often left tied up. The other sister was assaulted by Georgia in the bathroom with a wooden spoon, both sexual in nature. All surviving children remember Georgia's room very vividly, and it was a place of severe abuse. They were terrified of the bathtubs in the home because that was where they were held underwater and staff would threaten to drown them. Horrifying. And it's bad enough that that's going on, but their adoptive and foster homes weren't much better. They were getting assaulted there too because, as we said earlier, they were never investigated or vetted in any way. So it's heartbreaking. These children had zero voice, and all these caregivers were just betraying them and hurting them. And it's believed that 500 children may have died as a result of these acts in this home. And all the while, Georgia's just making bank through all this. The average adoption at the time cost $7. I know. Her adoptions could cost up to $5,000. Yeah. She had 2 workers that she would send on the road, Alma Walton and Regina Warner. They would travel to places like California and New York with 5 or 6 babies in tow about every 3 weeks. And they would meet with prospective parents that were wealthy and have them adopted out. And these families would write checks for $700, which would be about $13,000 today, directly to Georgia instead of the agency, because they were told that the checks were covering actual expenses. Her own. But she kept records of these babies, but she would change that and say they had been adopted in-state. So that way she could just squirrel away all those profits that would have come from an out-of-state adoption. So she's lying all the way around. And then she would tuck this money away in secret bank accounts under a fake name so it couldn't be traced. She's smart. Scary smart. And then she always would make promises to some of these adoptive parents so that they could get their wants and needs. So if you wanted a baby of a specific background, like a Jewish baby, she promised to get you one. I mean, she lying. She's not. She's just saying that the baby's Jewish, and she would say that it had a name, or its family had a name that sounded Jewish. All the while, it could be from any walk of life. She didn't know. She didn't care. And the whole time all this is going on, she is standing up and criticizing other agencies and the abuse allegations that they were facing. Like, look over here, not over here. It's gross. And legislators would go out of their way to help her get laws changed because so many of them were friends or her clients. So they wanted to help her. And she was trying to make huge moves in adoptions, and she was successful in getting legislation passed to have more closed adoptions or sealed records for birth and adoptions. I mean, I'm sure she did. I mean, she was faking documents, and that probably made it easier. She didn't have to fake them if they were all sealed up. Sadly, she even began receiving celebrity clients, and that's how I heard about her. One of her infants that were adopted to a Memphis couple would go on to become the professional wrestler Ric Flair, and even speak about his adoption in his book, To Be the Man. He was one of those babies that Georgia had kidnapped. So, I mean, I'm a wrestling fan, so that hit hard for me. And then probably a name that all you guys would know would be one of her more famous clients, which was actress Joan Crawford, whose twin daughters, Kathy and Cynthia, were adopted through the agency. And then she also adopted to celebrities like June Allison and Dick Powell, Lana Turner, and New York Governor Herbert Lehman. So quite the clientele. Eventually, the Child Welfare League of America pleaded with Georgia to stop like all this quirky advertising of adoptions and things. And when she didn't, they started looking into her. By 1941, they completely stopped endorsing the Memphis branch when they found out she had been destroying documents, even though she claimed that was due to state privacy laws and protection of the clients. And they also discovered that she was not investigating prospective parents, children's heritage, or placing kids in suitable homes, rather just letting parents pick which kid they wanted. And she was very well known for her speedy adoptions and the interstate adoptions, so it was becoming extremely obvious she was never investigating anything. Her employees weren't properly trained, and basically the seams are just unraveling at this point. And the more they looked into it, the more that they found, right? In 1946, a judge wrote the commissioner of the state to please launch an investigation. At the time, Governor Jim McCord refused to investigate, but by 1950, new Governor Gordon Browning did prompt an investigation with hopes of getting some of the state money back based on the ill-placed adoptions, but said he didn't want anybody formally indicted. He just kind of wanted her shut down. So the home was shut down that year. Articles are going all over the place about, black market babies and that she could have been doing this for 10 years. And it was actually found that the home had brought in $1 million, which today would be about $11 million. So just crazy amounts of money. On September 15th, 1950, Georgia would die of uterine cancer just a few days after that home was shut down. So she was herself never actually officially investigated, but survivors begged attendees of her open casket funeral to confirm for them that she was really dead and she hadn't faked it because they were so afraid. And that's heartbreaking. On her death certificate, she is listed as single, but she had $80,000 left, and she gave half to Anne, who she actually had adopted several years prior, which apparently was a way for same-sex couples to allow partners to inherit land and assets, since they couldn't legally marry back then. No one who ever worked for Georgia was ever charged. Abusers were outed later in life, but by that point, no charges were brought. We were past, I guess, statute of limitations, maybe. Both state and federal investigations were shut down in 1951, and the cries of birth parents fell on deaf ears. In 1951, legislation was also passed that sealed all adoption records. So just a rough go, but finally Tennessee would strengthen its adoption laws following this debacle and would take measures to make sure that birth parents weren't being coerced, they were making sound decisions. Georgia, however, did lay the ground for so many closed and confidential adoptions that a lot of children were never reunited with their birth parents. In 1994, there was a big movement to have the records of the 5,000 children that Georgia had stolen pressed through her operation, their records opened and revealed. And by 1995, victims were given access. In 1996, indirect victims were given access to their records. Now, I'm not sure how well that worked since she had forged so many documents. I couldn't find a number of how many were successfully reunited. I'm sure it wasn't many, and that just breaks my heart into a million pieces for those parents and those children who don't know where they came from. And sadly, we know there is still a lot of this type of trafficking going on in the world today, but that's why we're here and why we're talking about this today. We want to keep awareness. We want to try to shine light into an extremely dark, dark world, which can include children being sold into prostitution, slavery. It's particularly popular in other countries when they're like adopting to wealthy American families, you know, the selling and things. So please be careful when you are adopting, but let's be clear. Adoption is a beautiful and a wonderful thing, and open adoption is much more common today, and it allows birth parents to still be in their child's life, and along with, you know, some common agreements and terms between them and the adoptive parents as well. The child then they have two families, and they don't have to worry about this link about where they came from. So little tiny sliver of light, there is a memorial in Elmwood Cemetery marking 19 graves that we can link directly to Georgia and where she buried these victims. It was put up in 2015, and it pays an homage to the sweet babies that she left there. But it's just so sad to think about what is an amazing and beautiful thing in adoption was just so cold and callous in the wrong hands. And also, it's kind of insane to me to think about what she could have truly done had she not been so awful. She was brilliant. She was a trailblazer. She could have done so much good and just kind of washed her hands with it. We faced a situation where we were going through the adoption process prior to becoming pregnant, and it is the most eye and heart opening process that I've ever been through, and also so vulnerable that I found myself just being extremely angry at Georgia for the advantage that she took over these people. And I'd say she's a ditch cat, but it's probably too nice, and she'd probably just sell that too if she had a chance. So I don't have a good name for her except just hateful and greedy. So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments down below. Keep those case suggestions coming. I'm looking into that one for you, Pagan Mama. But until next time, I want y'all to stay safe. I want you to stay sweet in my cupcakes, and I will see you next time. Bye!